The year is 2025. Global debt has surpassed $315 trillion. The United States alone owes $38 trillion. Every nation, every corporation, and virtually every citizen is buried under a colossal weight of obligations. You were taught in school that debt is a liability, an obligation owed by one party to another. But if everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Who is the entity so powerful that it receives interest payments from every corner of the planet? The answer is not a country. It is a system. A financial system engineered over 3 centuries by 4 key figures whose documented goal was to make government debt permanent, profitable, and impossible to escape. This debt, which consumes $1 trillion annually just in interest payments from US taxpayers alone, is not an accident. It is the core design feature of modern finance. This is not a conspiracy theory. Every meeting, every charter, every mechanism that created this $315 trillion global prison is documented public record. Understanding this pattern explains why government debt only grows, never shrinks, and why that reality is the ultimate transfer of wealth from the laboring class to the financial elite. There is a pattern in history that reveals how sovereign debt, once made permanent, inevitably leads to the total destruction of the currency and the collapse of the social order. Right now, the global system is following that exact same pattern, stage by stage, innovation by innovation, and the outcome is locked in. The pattern begins in 1694 in London. England, facing a war with France, was bankrupt. The treasury was empty. The ancient problem of kings was simple. When a government borrows money, the debt has a maturity date. At that point, the king must either pay it back or default and lose credibility. Debt was a temporary burden. Enter William Paterson, a Scottish banker, and a handful of powerful merchants. Paterson presented King William III with the most radical, most destructive financial innovation of the modern age, the chartering of the Bank of England. The deal was simple and diabolical. The Crown would borrow $1.2 million from the newly formed Bank of England at 8% interest. In exchange, the bank was granted a monopoly on issuing notes, money, and crucially the ability to create money backed by the government's debt. But here is the core mechanism of the trap. The principal of this debt was never required to be repaid. Paterson's genius was to transform government debt from a temporary liability into a permanent, perpetual asset for the lenders. The debt became the national debt, an endless lien on the future earnings of the taxpayer. It was no longer a matter of if the debt would be repaid, but when the interest was due. The government was freed from the burden of repayment, and the banking cartel was guaranteed an eternal stream of income secured by the nation's taxing power. For the first time, money was not backed by gold or silver, but by the promise of perpetual debt. Ancient Rome, debt was a specific obligation. 1694, England. Debt became a permanent structural feature. Paterson's innovation turned the state into an interest slave and the citizen into the collateral. This single act is the foundation upon which the $315 trillion global debt edifice is built. The system was now designed to require permanent growing debt. Paterson made debt permanent. Nathan Rothschild made it irresistibly profitable. The year is 1815. The fate of Europe hangs on the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo. Rothschild, the dominant government bond trader in London, viewed war not as a clash of ideologies but as the ultimate debt creation event. He received the intelligence of the British victory against Napoleon a full 24 hours before the official courier reached the government. Rothschild did not celebrate. He went to the London Stock Exchange and began panicked selling of his British government bonds. Seeing the most powerful financier in Europe dumping his holdings, other traders believed the catastrophic lie: Britain had lost the war. A mass panic ensued. Bond prices plummeted to their lowest possible point. At that moment, Rothschild's agents quietly moved across the floor and bought every bond they could at rock-bottom prices. When the official news of Wellington's victory broke, bond prices instantly exploded. Rothschild became obscenely wealthy, increasing his fortune by a factor of 20 in a single day. The Rothschild innovation. He proved that the greatest profit was not in financing stable governments, but in manipulating the risk and chaos of sovereign debt. He made the bond market so liquid, so responsive to fear, that governments found borrowing money faster and easier than collecting taxes. This sealed the pattern. Politicians love debt because it allows for immediate spending with a delayed political price. Financiers love debt because they can profit from its creation, its panic, and its eternal interest payments. Borrowing became a political necessity and a financial goldmine. The only thing missing was a mechanism to generate an infinite supply of money to fund the endless borrowing. The system needed a boundless source of credit. If governments wanted to borrow infinitely, the market had to lend infinitely. In November 1910, 7 of America A.S. most powerful banking and financial figures, including representatives from the Rockefeller and Morgan empires, met in secret on Jekyll Island, Georgia. They traveled under assumed names, maintaining absolute secrecy. Their goal: to seize control of the nation's money supply and remove the final obstacle to unlimited government borrowing, the scarcity of the gold-backed currency. The result of that secret meeting was the framework for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This act was publicly sold as a measure to stabilize the banking system. But its true, documented purpose was to create a legal mechanism for the government to bypass the limitations of a finite productive economy, the diabolical mechanism of the Fed. 1. Congress creates debt. The U.S. government decides to spend money and issues treasury bonds, debt certificates to raise the cash. 2. The Fed creates money. When the open market cannot or will not absorb enough of this debt, the Federal Reserve intervenes and buys the bonds. Where does the Fed get the money to buy $100 billion in government debt? Nowhere. The Fed simply creates the money out of thin air with a few keystrokes on a computer. Let's be clear, the Federal Reserve transformed government debt from a fixed financial problem into a monetary problem solvable by infinite currency creation. This removed all fiscal discipline. It empowered politicians to spend future generations into debt today, and it guaranteed the banking cartel a permanent buyer for their debt instruments. Paterson, 1694, made debt perpetual. Rothschild, 1815, made debt profitable. Fed, 1913, made debt limitless by monetizing it. The $38 trillion U.S. national debt is not an accident of reckless spending. It is the system's intended outcome. The modern state, like a machine, requires a constantly increasing supply of debt to function. But the final layer of the trap was yet to be set, one that extended the financial prison globally. The final architect of the modern debt system was Paul Volcker, whose actions in the late 1970s and early 1980s locked the entire developing world into eternal servitude. In 1979, Volcker, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, aggressively raised interest rates to combat rampant domestic inflation. He pushed the federal funds rate to over 20%. The consequences were immediate and devastating, both at home and abroad. The most catastrophic effect was the Latin American debt crisis. During the 1970s, countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed huge sums from U.S. banks at low variable interest rates. When Volcker spiked the rates to 20%, the debt service payments for these nations tripled overnight. Their economies collapsed instantly. Mexico defaulted in 1982. The U.S. banking cartel, whose balance sheets were suddenly exposed, refused to take the loss. The solution, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank were deployed as the global enforcers of the perpetual debt trap. The IMF did not forgive the debt. Instead, it offered the defaulting nations new loans, more debt, to pay the interest on the old debt. But these new loans came with brutal structural adjustment programs, SAPs. The SAPs mandated massive cuts to social spending, healthcare, education, forced privatization of state assets, oil companies, utilities, telecommunications, which were sold at fire sale prices to Western corporations, and devaluation of local currencies. The result? Developing nations were forced to sell their real productive assets, the true wealth of the country, to pay the interest on fiat debt. They became trapped in a cycle where they must constantly borrow more money just to service the interest, ensuring the principal debt is never repaid. Let's be clear. Volcker's rate shock, followed by the IMF's enforcement, created the mathematical certainty of eternal debt slavery for the developing world. The transfer of wealth from taxpayer to bondholder, from poor nations to the financial elite, was now a global documented policy. The four architects had completed the prison. Paterson made the walls, perpetual debt. Rothschild installed the engine, profit from crisis. The Fed provided the fuel, infinite credit. Volcker, IMF, globalized the bars, structural adjustment and perpetual interest trap. With the trap complete, we must now ask the ultimate question. Who is getting rich? The $1 trillion in annual interest payments from U.S. taxpayers is not disappearing. It is being transferred. The debt machine is complete. The system is running. But who is actually sitting on the receiving end of the world's $315 trillion obligation? Who is the ultimate creditor? The answer is simple, shocking, and quantified. The bondholders. In 2025, the US government is projected to spend over $1 trillion on interest payments alone. That figure, which now surpasses the entire defense budget, is not a cost. It is an annual wealth transfer. Let us track where that $1 trillion goes. 1. Domestic banks and funds. The primary creditors are the largest financial institutions and investment funds in the United States. They buy treasury bonds, viewing them as the most secure, high-yield asset on earth. Why? Because they know the Federal Reserve will always be the buyer of last resort. This $1 trillion stream is pure risk-free profit flowing directly from the taxpayer to the Wall Street elite. 2. Global corporations, large multinational corporations hold treasury debt as a risk-free parking space for their surplus cash. The system is designed to incentivize the biggest businesses to become creditors of the state, ensuring their political influence over the system remains absolute. 3. Foreign nations, the hostages. For decades, China and Japan were massive holders of US treasuries holding trillions of dollars in paper debt. Why? They had to. The petrodollar system forced them to acquire dollars, and treasuries were the designated safe parking spot. They were not creditors by choice, but financial hostages in the debt prison. The system is a closed loop designed to enrich a narrow documented class. The four architects, Paterson, Rothschild, the Fed, and Volcker, ensured that debt is a risk-free income annuity for the financial ruling class, secured by the mandatory future labor of the citizen. This is the ultimate con. The middle-class worker pays taxes. That tax money is used to pay the interest on the debt. That interest is then collected by the institutions where the elite hold their wealth. The system legally and perpetually siphons wealth upward in a documented, unavoidable transfer. The question isn't if the debt is a problem, it's why the entire political apparatus is geared toward ensuring the problem can never be solved. Every time a politician promises to pay down the debt, they are either lying or fundamentally misunderstanding the system. The $38 trillion US debt can never be paid off. This isn't because of bad political will. It's due to a mathematical singularity created by the Federal Reserve. Here is the devastating logic. The debt is the money supply. Since 1913, the majority of the money in circulation is created when the Federal Reserve or commercial banks purchase government debt. In simple terms, the act of borrowing creates the cash, repaying the debt destroys the cash. If the US Treasury were to suddenly generate a $38 trillion surplus and repay all outstanding debt, that money would be retired from the financial system. The singularity, if $38 trillion is retired, the money supply contracts by $38 trillion. This would lead to a deflationary shock so catastrophic that every bank would instantly collapse, every market would freeze, and the entire global financial system would cease to function. Translation: paying off the debt is the economic equivalent of detonating a nuclear bomb in Manhattan. It is the only action guaranteed to destroy the United States in a single day. The politicians know this. The bankers know this. The debt is not an error. It is the foundation. The system demands that the debt must grow, or the money supply shrinks, and the global economy crashes. Therefore, the only sustainable state for the perpetual debt machine is managed inflation, the soft, slow destruction of the currency to reduce the real value of the debt over time while keeping the money supply growing. But managed inflation is a gamble. And history proves that sooner or later, managed inflation always spirals into unmanaged hyperinflation. The $38 trillion debt cannot be paid. It can only be defaulted on, either through a sudden, explicit refusal to pay, hard default, or more likely, through currency collapse, soft default. We are rapidly approaching the loss of confidence stage, the final fatal turn that finished Rome, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The trigger is the interest rate, the debt spiral. Stage 5 locks us into a nightmare choice. Choice A, raise rates to fight inflation. If the Fed attempts to honestly fight the inflation caused by past money printing, the $38 trillion debt interest payments skyrocket. The government's balance sheet collapses, leading to a hard default, government insolvency. Choice B, print money, QE, to keep rates low. The government chooses to maintain the debt illusion by having the Fed print trillions more to suppress interest rates. The world sees this final act of desperation. Confidence breaks. The dollar's value instantly collapses, triggering hyperinflation, soft default. The political system, always prioritizing short-term survival, will choose choice B. It will sacrifice the currency to save its own political structure, exactly as Rome debased the denarius to pay its legions. The signal will be clear. When the Federal Reserve becomes the sole permanent buyer of US Treasury debt, the game is over. The $38 trillion is revealed to be a lie, a digital marker on a screen backed by nothing. But the government's willingness to steal the purchasing power from every single citizen holding a dollar. The architects created the perfect machine. They guaranteed that debt would be permanent, profitable, and limitless. But they failed to engineer the one thing that cannot be controlled: human faith. And when that faith breaks, the $315 trillion system that took 4 men 3 centuries to build will collapse under the simple weight of mathematics. We began by asking who the ultimate creditor is. The answer is not a person, but the perpetual system of debt engineered by 4 architects over 300 years. Their masterpiece is a system where the interest payment is the final perfected tax, a legally binding transfer of wealth secured by the state, but controlled by private finance. Review the blueprint. William Paterson made the debt permanent. He gave the state the poison pill, the ability to spend without ever truly having to face repayment, addicting the system to borrowing. Nathan Rothschild made the debt profitable. He demonstrated how chaos, war, and market manipulation could turn government bonds into the highest yield, risk-free assets for the elite. The Federal Reserve made the debt limitless. It provided the legal framework to create infinite currency out of thin air to fund the borrowing, ensuring the machine never ran out of fuel. Paul Volcker and the IMF made the debt global. They extended the interest trap to the developing world, ensuring that $315 trillion in obligations would be serviced by the world's labor force, regardless of national borders or democratic will. The collective impact is a financial system that cannot function without growth in debt. If debt is not growing, the money supply is not growing. If the money supply is not growing, the economy is collapsing. The system is not designed for stability or solvency. It is designed for perpetual motion, fueled by the slow, constant debasement of the currency, the soft default that steals your purchasing power while politicians claim they are managing the economy. The $38 trillion US debt and the $315 trillion global obligation represent the limit of human credulity. The entire edifice rests on one single, fragile foundation: the belief that the debt will eventually be made good, or at least that the interest will keep flowing. That belief is breaking now, in 2025. The breaking point is the interest rate trap. As the cost of servicing the $38 trillion debt surpasses defense spending, the market realizes the truth. The government cannot raise taxes high enough to pay the interest, and it cannot cut spending deep enough to save itself. The only way out is the final act of fraud. The Federal Reserve is forced to print money to buy the debt, monetizing the entire obligation. When the Fed makes this move, when it is openly buying trillions of dollars of its own government as debt, the world will understand that the US dollar is now a closed-loop Ponzi scheme. The debtors, the US Treasury, the government, the creditors, the Federal Reserve, the money printer, the collateral, your labor, your savings, and the value of your currency. When the global financial system recognizes the fraud, the flight begins. The foreign banks, the sovereign wealth funds, the central banks, they will begin a coordinated move out of the dollar and out of US treasuries, moving into hard assets like gold, commodities, and sovereign currencies backed by production. This is not a slow decline. This is the Soviet Union's 900-day implosion on a global scale. It is the moment the 315 trillion illusion, the product of 3 centuries of careful engineering, hits the wall of mathematical reality. The architects built the prison perfectly, but they forgot the single historical constant. The debt always wins. It is the perfect self-executing weapon of empire destruction. The system is complete. The stage is set. The math is undeniable. Maybe we're different. Maybe the United States, with its unparalleled military and technological might, can do what England, Spain, and Rome could not. Maybe the Federal Reserve can defy the laws of economics forever. But the pattern says otherwise. The math says otherwise. The history says the debt always comes due, and the price is always paid by the person holding the paper. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past.